Hey everyone, I'm back to talk about some content. I promised that I'd go into a little bit more detail about the content, the readings for each week, and so I want to focus on the two that I've set up for week one in particular, the Introduction to Ethical Thinking, and then the second one being the Ethical Online Learning, Critical Pedagogy, and Social Justice. I've mentioned quite a bit about, or a little bit about, I guess, the 5 ethical frameworks that you can find in Introduction to Ethical Thinking, but I wanted to also point out that the document covers more than just those 5 frameworks. It does a nice job right here of talking about what ethics are not, and I've mentioned the idea that ethics are not just sort of your feelings or what you think is right. Again, I won't go through all of those, but I think they do a really nice job of outlining some things, and so it'll be important for you to think about what ethics is not, and then for your group to also be willing to say when you're having a discussion, hey, I don't think we're taking an ethical perspective here. I think you're talking about ethics as law here, or I think you're talking about ethics as following culturally accepted norms. And this document does a nice job of explaining that there's more to ethics than that, and sometimes we might challenge culturally accepted norms, and that's part of being ethical. So be sure to spend a little bit of time with those 5 bullets as well to be clear in your mind about what ethics are not. It does a nice job of talking about why we should be ethical. Virtue is its own reward, always a good thing to remember. Again, I'll let you work through that. But we're really trying to get ethical actions that become part of your thinking. One of the things that we won't really be able to get at in this class is that a lot of thinking in computer science right now is that the ethical component needs to happen at the development stage. We're going to end up looking at a lot of end products and sort of debating those, but the more you can get good at being an ethical thinker and bring that ethical thinking into the development stage of a piece of software or a larger project where a software fits in, that's going to be beneficial to you in your professional future. It admits that identifying ethical standards is hard, and knowing what standards we're going to follow consistently is an important part of this class. One of the goals is that by the end of the class you'll have a pretty keen sense of what your ethical defaults are. I think I've said in some of the documents that I find that I tend to go towards virtue first. I tend to, and we'll see that even this weekend in the authors, they're also the same way. They're sort of looking at what's good about online education, what can be an approach that brings out the best in their students, that brings out their voices in their students. It's kind of a virtue approach. That's good for them, it's good for me, but those of us who have that approach also need to make sure that we think about the other perspectives as well. So here are the big 5. I've talked about those in the introduction. I've tried to highlight just what I think is sort of like the real core to each one of these, and so you can pause and take a look at this if you need to, but utilitarian really comes down to the greatest good for the greatest number, but they also throw in that nice line that's also used in a lot of your professional documents, that it is also something that is good, that does not do harm, not only for people but communities and environment. And I think those are really important things to keep in mind. The rights approach, I think we're going to see an awful lot of when we come to issues here, and it just gets highlighted at the end on privacy and surveillance, right? Those are some of the big individual rights that a lot of emerging technologies are going to challenge, or you're going to have to think through how much of a challenge do these technologies present to somebody's privacy. How are they be handled in an ethical way? Fairness and justice is going to be partly an access issue. Who has access to technologies? We're going to see that. And I think you'll end up seeing that the perspectives, the framework will ask similar questions of each issue when we get to it. So online education this week, what do we want the internet to be next week? We're going to ask some of these same questions, and you might find yourself having some of the same answers, which is one of the reasons why I'm asking you to take different perspectives each week to try it out, see how that different perspective feels to you. The common good approach, I think one of the things that you'll need to get clear in your own mind is, how is the common good approach similar to and different than utilitarianism? And I won't try to answer that for you right here. I'll let you figure that out as we go along. And then the virtue approach, which I've mentioned a couple times, one of my favorites. As a teacher, right, this is what I like to do, try to help students to know more, to be better at what they do, to be better communicators, to be better writers, to be better online presenters. And so that's appealing to me, but I need to keep those other rights in mind as I try to do that as an educator. The document then goes on to do a nice job of talking about we often aren't just one thing, that we combine some of these approaches, and so that's going to be important. And again, it's another reason why I'm asking you to try out different perspectives as you go along. And then it gets into making decisions. So each week it might seem a little frustrating. Oh, we talk about these issues, but do we ever do anything about it? I'm going to try to help you sort of close that loop each time and think about what can you actually do in response to the discussion for the week. So online education, I'm going to ask you to, for this week, to be really reflective about what it is we're doing in this class. The obvious action step is going to be really to actually challenge you, maybe not in week one, but at the end of the semester, to talk to the faculty members in your department and say, maybe this class that we're being asked to do online for ethics and computer science shouldn't be an online class. Maybe it should be face-to-face. Or there could be some other ethical perspective. I don't want to say that because I think it's going to be pretty awesome doing it this way, but you might come to that decision, or you might come to another decision about or another conclusion about how to make it most effective for your program. The document then goes on to talk about some of the ethical decision-making obstacles that you might run into. I just highlighted a couple that I think you'll see in the article, and let me say here, just as a way to get transition into the other article, is that really hope that you read this first and then think about how it's going to apply to the article that you're going to read, and then next week come back and review this and apply it to the video that we're going to look at next week as sort of our key document. And so that you're going to see in today's or this week's reading that that the authors, when they were being unethical, they acknowledged that they were unethical at times in their educational careers as professionals working to develop online materials for other courses, that they were doing it because it was part of their job, and they recognize now that it was pretty unethical what they were doing, but they thought they had to do what their job required them to do. And so, but then they had to figure out, need to do something else. But that can take a while, and we often start with, well, it's part of the job. And closely related, everyone's doing it. So part of my job, everybody in the field is doing it. I guess I'll do it as well. Hopefully this class will help you think through those issues more quickly maybe than others who often are confronted with these kinds of challenges, and you can move to a more ethical position more quickly. Again, lots of information here. I'll let you work through that and see how it applies to this week's reading. The last piece of this document that's important is that what they're also trying to do is really set up a stage, and I'm asking you to really follow this same stage. I'm asking you to prepare each week for your discussion. So I've highlighted preparing the environment, and so that might mean trying to find a time and a place where you can all get together and make a recording of your conversation. Honestly, that seems like the most exciting thing and most interesting way to do it. I think the conversation would flow most naturally. So I didn't even mention that one. I went straight to the Zoom, which seems like the second best option, but if you can all get together in a room, I think that would be good for you. Assess what kind of problem you're dealing with each week, right? And I'll try to help you frame some of that a little bit as well. Most in each week, often the materials sort of have a pretty strong point of view already. The first one is going to look at how can we make online education ethical, right? So they're working towards that. They're not really debating it. They're saying it is often unethical. How do we make it ethical? We'll see in week 2 Tim Berners-Lee wanting to say we need a better internet. How do we get there? Right. So often they're framing it as ethical questions about we know that we're in a situation of flux and we need to move in the right direction. We need to move in the ethical direction. So each week we'll try to clarify that, as well as things like facts and values. The decide part here, the way I'm asking you to handle that is that to have your discussion, and then especially with the groups of 5, there'll be a 6th person who kind of just gets to be themselves, not an ethical perspective. And hopefully that person will be up to the challenge of deciding, out of our discussion, I think utilitarianism seems like the way to go this week. Or, as I've already been talking, maybe you're convinced by the authors that we read, and virtue approach seems like the way to go. But each week we'll try to make a decision and not just leave each conversation hanging. Now, often that decision will not necessarily be one that sticks forever and ever, but for now, this seems like the best way to think about whatever ethical problem we're looking at. And then that implementation means talking to your faculty. It might mean in what does it take to make the internet better? You're going to have some pretty clear choices on that. We've got one week 6. We're going to look at a thing called humane technologies. They give you lots of steps for thinking about how to interact with technology in a more humane way. So you'll have a good chance to do some implementation there. Some of them might be harder. We're going to look at things like artificial intelligence and augmented reality. If you're not working in those fields, you might wonder how you can work towards implementation. But then, of course, you're also users, right? So even if you're not developing AI or augmented reality applications, you might be able to think about how you would use them as an end user. And then reflect, and that's going to be an important part of your group as well, is not only to reflect on the ethical decision that you're being made, but also to reflect on how the group dynamics are going. All right, I spent a little bit more time on this than I thought I was going to. So I'm going to take a little break here and maybe create a second separate video for the other article.